Today we continue our look at the parable of the prodigal son. We looked at it last Sunday as well, and of course our pastor emeritus, our Wollo Moksanim, has been blessing us with this message for the past several Sundays. And so we'll continue looking at Luke 15. And last Sunday when we looked at it, we looked at how this story, the third part of a trilogy, contained these 3 D's, 2 don'ts, and 1 do. The first was, don't get in the way of God's grace. And this wasn't a message to the older brother, but to the younger brother himself, because he had to realize his mistake first. No one else could fix that for him. And he had to make the conscious decision to return to the Father's home, to follow through with that decision. He was the only one that could block God's grace, get in the way of God's grace. The second was, don't speculate on the sins of others. Don't speculate on the sins of others. Because of all the things that the older brother did in this story, the worst thing was that he judged his younger brother without ever even seeing him, meeting him, talking to him, learning about his experiences. He assumed that he knew everything he needed to know. He already knew the sins of the younger brother, and he let his unholy imagination, remember we talked about last week, he let his unholy imagination take control of his lips, and he spread falsehoods about his brother. And the last was this: do celebrate the salvation of sinners, because they are who we once were. We must see a reflection of ourselves in these sinners, and remember that we were once in their situation. And in doing this, in rejoicing in their return, we will be fulfilling the will of our Father on earth below, just as it is done in heaven above. And today, as we continue looking at this parable, I want to look at the older brother and the father, how they reacted to the return of the younger son. Because in them, I think that we can see 2 very different models, 2 very different attitudes towards the return of the lost. Those who choose to return to the Father's home. And I think that we can learn from both of these models, both of their attitudes and examples. So first we look at the older brother. The older brother, as we mentioned last week, he was out in the fields. He was working when the younger brother returned. He was out in the fields, it says. And that when he returned from his duties, he was surprised to hear the sounds of celebration going on in the Father's home. And he wondered to himself, what is this? He heard music and dancing, shouting and singing. And I wonder in his mind if maybe he thought it was for him. Maybe it was a surprise party. He wondered, maybe my father has gotten a bride, a beautiful bride for me to finally marry. And he must have been so excited. And he's fixing his hair and washing the dirt off his face, smoothing out his clothes, he has to look presentable. And he calls a servant over. He calls the servant and he asks him, what's going on? Is this for me? And the servant, his face was full of joy. And he said, Master, good news. Your brother, your younger brother, has returned home. And your father has called for a celebration. He even killed the fattened calf in his honor. Come, join in the celebration. Come, join in the singing and the dancing. And upon hearing these words, the older brother, his curiosity, his wonder, turned into disappointment, and it transformed into anger, resentment, rage. An angry spirit took hold of his heart. This should have been a truly joyous occasion for the entire family. But the older brother was overcome with rage, and he wouldn't even enter into the Father's home. He refused to step into his home, his own home. And in this, we can see the older brother's attitude towards the return of the lost. He was unhappy. He was unhappy. He felt that he was wrongly done, unjust. Because he felt that he had received less of the Father's love, less of the Father's grace, less of the Father's provision, less of the Father's care. And he wondered, why have I received less? Don't I deserve more. And in this, I think we can find this principle. And this principle is this, that comparison is the killer of contentment. Comparison is the killer of contentment. As long as we insist on comparing ourselves with others, as long as we do that, this foolish activity, we will never be happy. Even though we are in our Father's house, even though we have everything that we need, we will never be happy as long as we insist on comparing ourselves with others. We wonder, why is this person richer? Why is this person taller? Why is this person funnier? Why is he smarter? Why do they have a better job? Why are they living in a bigger house? All these things. And these are very superficial, material things. But there's always something, isn't there? There's always something that we latch onto and say, why is this person better than me? Because comparison is the killer of contentment. Comparison robs us of joy. It eats away at our peace. It cuts down our thanks. That is what comparison does. This past week, one of my old youth group members messaged me, and she was very upset. She said, Pastor, this young woman, she works in the cosmetics industry, and she told me that there was big news. Everyone was talking about it in the cosmetics world, right? I really don't care. But she told me that Kylie Jenner had sold 51%, a little over half of her company, for $600 million. $600 million. And she is only 22 years old. 22 years old, 600 million. And she said, it's not fair. It's not fair. She was, half joking, but she said, it's not fair. Why can't we be that young? Why can't we be that rich? How come I can't have that life? But I considered the position of the person writing this to me. She's she works at a very well-known cosmetics company at Estee Lauder. And she has a very high position there. She's very well respected. She's very well paid. And she already bought her own house in New York, one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. She already bought her own house in her name. No one helped her. She's done all of this already at a very young age. And recently, she told me, the last time we talked, she told me that she had been scouted by Facebook. And they paid everything for her to come out to California and meet with the executives and tour the offices and all of this. She's living a dream life, right? And she worked hard. She deserves all of this. But how many people are out there at a young age who have worked hard, who have done the right things, and still are not in this position? It's incredibly difficult to even find any job these days. But this is all that she has been blessed with already at a very young age. And an important note, she's still single. So anyone that is picking up the radar, just talk to me afterwards. But comparison is the killer of contentment. When we compare ourselves with others, we cannot help but be unhappy. To think that the world has done something wrong to us, that we have been unjustly targeted. Living as the child of Korean immigrants, I know a lot about comparison. I'm very familiar with comparison because Korean parents love comparing. They love comparing. It's a very Korean thing to do, at least in the immigrant society. I don't know if it's true in Korea also, but in the Korean immigrant society, you compare endlessly. It never stops. Your parents are always comparing their parents and their children. Oh, did you hear? Oh, the son of Mrs. Park, Park 집사님 아들. Oh, the son of Mrs. Park, he studies so well. He's top of his class. He got a prize for studying so well. Oh, did you hear about the daughter of Mr. Choi? She got into medical school. Oh, medical school. She's going to be a doctor. And of course, in every neighborhood, every church, Every community, there's one kid that goes to Harvard, how about and just ruins it for everyone else. Like, he had to go to Harvard, so now we have to hear about him all the time, how he went to Harvard. But when does it end? How far can the comparison go? When we compare ourselves with others. There's always someone better. There's always someone smarter. There's always someone stronger. There's always someone better looking out there. I heard the story recently of a boy from California named Johnny. I want to tell you a little bit about Johnny because he has a very fascinating life. I read that Johnny was a very shy boy. He was very shy. He was lacking in self-confidence. He felt that he had nothing to offer the world. And he was always one of the smallest kids in his class. So this was a complex for him. But when he was 16 years old, he heard about the U.S. Navy SEALs. And he thought, you know what? I'm going to be a Navy SEAL. I'm going to grow up to be a Navy SEAL. And I'm sure many people must have laughed at him. But he said, this is my life's goal. I'm going to become a U.S. Navy SEAL. And so he joined the Navy right out of school. And he applied for the SEALs program. You have to join the Navy first, and then you apply for the SEALs. And then if you're accepted, you have to get through the training. And the training, you can go on YouTube it later. It's very intense. It's notoriously difficult. I found out the acceptance into the SEALs program is 6%. And then out of those, only 1/4, 1 out of 4, makes it through the actual training program. So if you calculate that, I think my math is correct, it's 1.5% acceptance rate. 1.5% make it through to actually become SEALs. But he made it all the way through and he became a SEAL. Special Forces. 특공대, right? They call it in Korea. And he completed over 100 combat missions as an elite Special Forces operator, soldier. But during his time in the SEALs, he was so moved by the doctors that helped treat him and his fellow soldiers. And he recounts especially one experience of his friend receiving a wound, and he was trying to help him, but he didn't have the skills and the knowledge to be able to do so. And he says he watched his friend die in front of him. And he was so moved by this experience that he said he wanted to become a doctor. So fresh out of the Navy SEALs, he applied to medical school. Not just any medical school, but Harvard Medical School. He was accepted to Harvard, graduated, and became a resident physician at a Massachusetts hospital. But while he was studying at Harvard, he heard from one of his mentors about the physician astronaut program at NASA. And he thought, oh, maybe I'll try for that. So he applied, and out of almost 20,000 applicants, he was one of 12 people selected. So I did the math again, it's 0.06%. And I read that he's expected to graduate from training this year and become a full astronaut, and then they're going to, I guess, send him to space. But I thought, wow, this is amazing. He's a Navy SEAL. He's a Harvard-educated doctor, and now he's an astronaut. He's going to be in space. You know, they talk a little bit lately about the space army, but this would be a good guy for the space army, right? But one last detail, Johnny's full name is Johnny Yong Kim. Johnny Yong Kim, the son of Korean immigrants in LA. And I read this story and my heart was very heavy because Johnny just ruined it for Korean children all over the world. Who can be compared to him? Comparison is a black hole. It never ends. It just keeps on taking and taking and taking. As I said before, it robs us of our joy. It eats away at our peace. It cuts down our thanks. It is a black hole that never ends. All it does is take and take and take from us. There are people like Johnny Kim in the world. that we cannot compare to. And there are people that even Johnny Kim looks at and thinks, how can I be anything compared to this person? The problem with comparison is that there's always someone better. There's always someone better. For the older son, comparison was the killer of his contentment. And if you consider it, the older son had a lot of things to be thankful for. The younger son had spent his time living out in the darkness, living in the cold. But the older son had spent all that time in the light and warmth of the father's house. If the father's home in this story is supposed to signify God's house, the presence and provision of God's house, then what a blessing it was for the older son to be there the entire time. And it says that this older son was working in the field when his younger brother returned. He was out in the field. This shows us that the older son was a valued member of the father's household because the father had entrusted this important, life-giving work to the older son. We have to think about how close the connection was for people in this time between the crops and their lives. It was literally what they grew out of the ground would feed them for the next year. 1 year of bad crops could ruin a family, could ruin an entire family. But this was the older son's duty. This was his responsibility that the father had given to him. And not only that, but we see that the older son was a man of authority. He was a man of authority. When he told the servant to come, the servant came. You know, coming to Korea, I learned a very powerful gesture. It's this. 이리 와봐. Do you know how much power you have to do this and make someone come? Right? That's not something that you can just do to anybody. Right? But you say, come. And they come running. That was the position that this older son had. He told the servant to come and the servant came. He asked the servant to tell him something and the servant told him. He had power. There were people and animals and equipment. All of this moved at the son's orders when the son spoke. He was second in command to his father. He was a man of authority. And never once in the story does it mention any change in his inheritance, because the older son also had an inheritance, right? The younger son received his inheritance, but the older son actually still had his. And in those times, it wouldn't have been half, it would have been more than half, because he was the older son. And the father doesn't call the older son and say, look, your younger brother is back. Why don't we give him a part of your inheritance? He never says that. So the older son's inheritance was still intact. It was still there. But he lost sight of all of this. He was blind to all of this. He forgot all the blessing that he had received, all the abundance that he had in light of one fattened calf. One fattened calf. How fat could it have been? Over this one fat calf, the older brother forgot everything. This is the effect of comparison when it takes over our lives, when we allow it to take over our lives, because it causes us to forget about all that God has given us. We are effectively we're telling God to his face, what you have given us is not enough because I want more. There's someone out there that has more than me, so I am not happy. That is what comparison is saying. If we are to find contentment in the Father's house, we must stop comparing. We have to stop comparing. And I read one quote that I think puts it very well. The quote says, "The only reason you should ever look into the bowl of your neighbor is to make sure that they have enough. Never to see if they received more than you. Never to make sure that you got more than them. It's only to check to see if they have enough." That is the only reason that we should be looking into our neighbor's bowls, how much they have got. How many times have we gone to the cafeteria here at our church, the 대식당, and you receive the food and you look to the side, they got a little more, you know? The only reason we should look to the side is to see if they have enough, not to make sure that we got more. And I think that brings us to our second point, that the attitude that the father had toward the younger son was very different. The attitude of the father was very different. It says in our verses that while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He was filled with compassion for the younger son. And he ran to him, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Kissed him. Although the older brother was filled with a spirit of comparison, the father, it shows us here, was filled with a spirit of compassion. Compassion. And I think this is the second principle that we can find in this parable, that compassion is the cultivator of community. Compassion creates community. Because compassion is what creates and builds up and restores broken communities and transforms them into healthy, functional communities. And we use this word compassion a lot. We see it everywhere. But we don't really think about what it means, because there are a lot of ways that we can care about the suffering of others. There are various types of caring. And I think there's a scale that goes in this order. The scale goes pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And it goes up on that scale. Pity is the lowest form of caring. Pity is the lowest form of caring. If you pity someone, that means you really don't care. Because when you pity someone, that just means that you know and acknowledge that, yes, you are suffering. I can see that. You're suffering. That's too bad. That's what pity is. Pity is reserved for people that you think are below you, that are not worthy of your concern. Pity really amounts to nothing. From there, we can progress a little bit and care a little more. And so we move to sympathy. Because sympathy goes beyond just acknowledging someone's suffering. Sympathy says that you do feel bad. I feel bad for your situation. That's sympathy. I feel bad for you. It doesn't sound very nice, right? But that's what sympathy is. It just says that you feel bad for someone, but it doesn't affect you personally. That I feel bad for you, but since you have no relation to me, that's it. I just feel bad for you. That's sympathy. If we go a little bit deeper, we can move on to empathy. Because empathy is more than just knowing someone's suffering, more than just feeling bad about someone's suffering. Empathy, when you empathize with someone, it means you feel their pain as your own pain. You see it through their eyes. You feel it through their eyes. Empathy is feeling bad together with someone for their suffering. And empathy is not a bad thing. Before we move on to compassion, I want to say empathy is not a bad thing. Empathy is very important. And actually, researchers have found that the common trend in many mental disorders is a lack of empathy. When people don't have empathy, they literally go crazy. You know, not to make fun of them, but they literally go crazy. So psychosis, schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder, these mental disorders, the common trend in a lot of them is that these people lack empathy. They lack the ability to feel the pain of others as their own. So empathy is a key part of what makes us healthy human beings, living in community with one another. Empathy is important. But compassion is more than just empathy, even though empathy is important. Because, you know, if we consider the word compassion itself, the roots, it's formed by joining the words suffer and together. So compassion literally, in this sense, means suffer together with someone. But the biblical sense of compassion goes beyond that, because the Bible means something a little bit different. It's very similar and overlapping with empathy, but there is a difference. The original Greek form of being filled with compassion is esplankniste. Esplankniste. We see this word again and again in the New Testament. Esplankniste, to be filled with compassion. And this came from the root word of splankna. And splankna literally means your inner parts, your heart, your liver, your lungs, your stomach and intestines. It was the guts of a person. So compassion, to be filled with compassion, the idea was that you felt it in your innermost being. You felt it in your internal organs. You felt it in your gut, deep, deep within, that you felt someone else's pain. But still, the biblical sense of compassion goes a little deeper than that, because it's more than something we feel. It's more than just an emotion that we have, a reaction. This word, as we said, was used in the New Testament in a couple of other places, and each time it was used to describe Jesus. It was used to describe what Jesus felt. It says that Jesus esplankniste, that he was filled with compassion. When Jesus saw people in distress, when he saw sinners in need of a savior, sheep in need of a shepherd, widows in need of a defender, the oppressed in need of a champion, it says Jesus had compassion, that he was filled with compassion for the people. So Jesus was filled with compassion and healed the people of disease and sickness and proclaimed the good news. Jesus was filled with compassion on the people and healed the sick before feeding the 5,000. And again it says Jesus was filled with compassion. The same word, esplankniste, every time. He was filled with compassion before feeding the 4,000 again. As Jesus was leaving Jericho, it says that 2 blind men were sitting by the side of the road, and these blind men could not see, and they cried out to Jesus. They cried out and shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And Jesus, when he heard them, in this case, it says it wasn't their faith that moved Jesus, but that he was filled with compassion. Jesus was filled with compassion, and he touched their eyes and restored their sight. When Jesus arrived at the town of Nain, it says that he saw a funeral taking place for the only son of a poor widow. And Jesus, when he saw this, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." That same word, esplankniste. Jesus was filled with compassion. His heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." And immediately Jesus went and commanded the young man to rise from the dead, and he did. And maybe the most well-known instance of esplankniste in the Bible is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we all know very well. When the Samaritan man saw the condition of the Israelite traveler who was beaten, robbed, stripped, left for dead, bleeding on the side of the road, when the Samaritan saw him, it says that he was filled with compassion. And immediately the Samaritan man took action to make sure that the man was healed, that he was taken care of. And he even said, "I will return again," to make sure that he is okay, to take care of any extra expense. He took this action. And I think the Bible shows us that this is what sets compassion apart from just empathy, even though empathy is very noble. Because empathy is a thought, or maybe it's an emotion, whatever it might be. But compassion is always followed by action. Compassion is always followed by action. It is not just suffering together with someone. It is actively taking steps to heal them, to help them, to restore that person. So if the father just felt bad for his son, if the father even had empathy for his younger son, maybe he would have given him a job as one of his servants. That was what the younger son expected. He expected maybe sympathy or empathy from his father. Give me a job like one of your hired servants so that I can eat something at least. Or maybe the father, in his pity, he would have said, here's a little bit of money. Go and live the rest of your life somewhere else because you are no longer my son. You had your chance here and you took it and you wasted it. So here's a little money. Go basically gojo, right? If the father felt pity, that's what he would have done. But in the father's compassion, because he was filled with compassion as Jesus was, as the Good Samaritan was, he actively took steps to restore the younger brother, to restore him to his full status as a son in the father's household. This is how compassion is the cultivator of community. Because when we have compassion, we don't just feel bad for people. We don't just feel bad with people. We take steps to restore them. We take steps to welcome them back into the community as full members. Not as pity members, but as full members. So as we conclude today's message, let us take to heart these 2 points from the parable of the prodigal son. Through the example of the older son, we see that comparison is the killer of contentment. He forgot everything that he had received in the father's house, simply because he was obsessed with what his younger brother had received. He lost sight of everything that we had. But we can see in the positive example of the father that compassion truly is the cultivator of community. That going beyond pity, sympathy, or even empathy, we must be people of compassion, just as Jesus was. We must be people who feel this esplankniste, who feel this compassion deep within our being. And not just feel it, but move into action, who take steps to love and restore the returning sons and daughters of God. Let us pray together.